Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, let's make things gentle. Perhaps you'd like to dim the lights, let the room soften, and take one slow breath in and out. If there's a window nearby, you might crack it just a little. Let the night air drift in like an old companion. Or if you prefer, imagine yourself beside a quiet fire, the flames holding steady against the dark. Tonight we step back in time, into winters that were harsher than most of us can imagine. Out on the American frontier, families faced nights so cold that water froze inside their cabins, and even breath turned to frost before it left the air. Yet in that icy struggle, they found ways to endure, through patience, through kindness, and through the quiet courage of ordinary days. If you'd like to keep sharing these journeys with me, you might gently tap that like button or subscribe. And if you're listening from a faraway place, I'd love to know. Write in the comments where you are tonight and what the night feels like there. I always enjoy picturing these stories finding their way into living rooms and bedrooms all across the world. Now, let the rest of the world slip away. Imagine frost tracing patterns on a small cabin window. Imagine the hush of snow pressing against the walls. And imagine, within that silence, a family carrying an unspoken wish for gentler days. And so we begin. A quiet longing carried through winter nights. Long before the first snow arrived, before the wind began to howl across the open plains, there was a wish. Not the kind of wish you say out loud, but one carried quietly in the heart, like a candle shielded by both hands. Every settler family who faced a prairie winter knew this wish. They hoped, softly, almost fearfully, that the food would last, that the fire would hold, that spring would come before their strength ran out. Picture a mother standing in her doorway in late autumn. The sun is setting early, brushing the horizon with pale gold. She doesn't speak, but her eyes move over the stacks of wood, the piles of dried corn, the barrels sealed in the root cellar. She counts without moving her lips, adding up weeks against supplies, and in her silence the wish stirs. Let it be enough. Inside, a father mends the handle of a shovel. He works slowly, rubbing oil into the wood with calloused hands. He doesn't want to say what he fears, that the handle might not last, that the cold might snap it like a twig when he needs it most. So he sands and oils and ties it tight, carrying his own version of that same quiet wish. Let the tools hold. Let us hold. And in the corner, children gather small things, extra scraps of fabric, the smoother stones that had been warmed by the stove. They don't yet know the full danger of winter. To them, it is half adventure, half game. But even in their voices, hushed by the tone of the room, there is that shared undercurrent. Let us stay together, warm enough, safe enough. You and I, lying warm tonight in modern comfort, might smile at their hope. But back then, hope was as necessary as bread. It kept hands moving when they were tired. It pushed families to share one more chore, one more hour of gathering fuel, one more jar of food stored away. Without it, the weight of endless cold might have broken them long before the storms did. There were diaries where settlers confessed, almost in whispers on the page, that winter felt like a test set by some unseen hand. They did not rail against it. They simply noted the aching bones, the frozen water bucket, the way breath crystallized in the air. One man wrote, "I dare not say my fears aloud, for they might grow heavier by my speaking." And so he too carried his wish in silence, like all the rest. Imagine the evenings, a lantern hissing softly, casting yellow halos against walls chinked with mud. The family sits close, their shadows large on the wall. No one speaks of fear, but everyone feels it. The father pokes the fire, the mother sews another patch into a quilt, the children watch the sparks rise, and beneath it all lies the same fragile thread, binding them tighter than the cold could loosen. Let us see spring. Sometimes, neighbors would visit before the storm set in. They would share coffee if they had it, or news from a town 2 days' ride away. These visits were short, but behind every handshake lingered the same question. Will you make it? Will we? They never asked outright. Pride forbade it. Yet the glance of one settler to another, the nod at a woodpile stacked too small, the silent exchange over a shared fence, all of it spoke louder than words. Even the animals carried a kind of quiet wish. Horses stamped in their stalls, breath clouding the air. Chickens huddled in corners, feathers puffed against drafts. Dogs curled close to their families, as if they too understood what was coming. And in those soft sounds, the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of feathers, the sigh of a dog at rest, one could almost hear the same prayer. Hold us safe through the night. Of course, not all wishes were answered. There are stories of families who fell short, who underestimated the fuel they would need, or who lost their stores to damp or mice. These are sobering tales, and yet they form part of the quiet background hum, the warning that made survivors plan better, hope harder, and cling to each other all the more. Still, amid the worry, there was beauty. A frost-lit dawn could turn the world silver, so bright it hurt the eyes. A cabin filled with the smell of bread, even if it was only cornbread, could lift spirits as high as summer once did. And the sound of laughter, a child giggling under too many quilts, or a father making a joke about smoke that refused to rise straight, carried a warmth deeper than any fire. So the wish was never entirely about survival. It was also about holding on to these small lights in the dark. Settlers wanted not only to reach spring alive, but to carry their spirit intact, to still laugh, still sing, still find the quiet beauty, even in the hardest season. That, too, was survival. Autumn leaves whisper of what lies ahead. Before the first real frost, before the wind sharpened its voice, autumn carried its signals across the prairie. Not loud ones, nothing shouted, but if you watched carefully, the season spoke in small, insistent ways. The slant of sunlight was one such whisper. By late September, the sun fell earlier, brushing cabins with a golden light that lingered only minutes before slipping away. Children noticed it first, the way playtime shortened, the shadows lengthened, and the air cooled faster once the light was gone. In those final weeks of warmth, families hurried. The earth still offered its fruits, but every gift had to be taken in, stored, protected. Imagine baskets filled with potatoes, the soil still clinging to their skins. Barrels lowered carefully into root cellars, the lids sealed with cloth and wax. Apples laid in straw-lined crates, checked one by one for bruises, because a single spoiled apple could ruin the lot. A father might be seen turning each fruit in his palm, like a jeweler weighing gems wasn't fussiness. It was survival in slow motion. Leaves, too, carried their message. Settlers watched cottonwoods shift from green to pale yellow, watched prairie grasses turn brittle, rattling like bones in the wind. These changes were beautiful, but they were also warnings. A dry leaf blown against the cabin door could sound like a knock from winter itself. One diary recorded, "The grass is brown, the sky deeper blue. It looks like heaven, but feels like a threat." Beauty and fear walked hand in hand on those October days. Inside homes, the rhythm quickened. Quilts were patched, even those already patched twice before. Curtains were made heavier, sometimes with old coats sewn into them. Gaps in walls were stuffed with rags, newspaper, or prairie grass twisted tight. Children were set to carry bucket after bucket of mud, pressing it into cracks where wind slipped through. Their laughter mixed with groans, for the work seemed endless. Yet mothers urged them on with soft voices. This is how we stay warm. Every handful matters. Fuel gathering dominated many autumn days. Wood was scarce on the open prairie, and families who were lucky enough to live near a riverbank might cut willow or cottonwood, piling the crooked logs high. Others relied on less obvious sources: twisted grass bound into knots, corn cobs saved from the harvest, sunflower stalks bundled in twine, and always the gathering of buffalo or cow chips. Children wandering fields with baskets, their small bodies bending again and again to pick what others might turn away from. The task was tedious, the smell unkind, yet settlers knew that each piece was worth its weight in life. One woman wrote in 1879, "Today I filled a whole wagon with chips. My back bent, my hands raw, but when I see the pile beside the house, I feel safer. It is not beauty, but it is heat." Imagine her pride, not in fine things, but in that humble stack. For her, those rough brown shapes were more precious than gold. Neighbors often visited during this season. They came not only for talk, but for silent comparison. How high was your fuel pile? How many jars stood in your cellar? Did your walls look tight against the coming wind? No one asked directly, but eyes traveled and measured, a nod of respect at a neatly stacked wall of sod bricks, a frown at a roof still missing shingles. These judgments weren't cruel. They were warnings unspoken. Everyone knew the prairie punished unpreparedness, and sometimes a neighbor's silence said more than words. Animals gave their signs, too. Horses grew thicker coats. Chickens seemed restless, pecking harder at the last scraps of grass. Dogs curled into themselves even before the nights turned bitter, as if they remembered winters past better than their masters did. Families often watched their animals with respect, even envy. A horse knew how to face into the wind, a dog how to burrow for warmth. These instincts were lessons, if one cared to learn, and then came the skies. Settlers spoke often of the way the horizon changed in autumn. A clear day could hold a thin line of silver, far off, yet undeniable. Clouds seemed to move faster, lower, darker at their edges. Children might marvel at the beauty, but adults felt the undertone. The heavens were rehearsing their fury. One Minnesota farmer wrote, "When the sky pulls low, I feel it in my bones. My hands work faster. My wife looks at me, and we both know without speaking." There were moments of peace amid the work. Families gathered on porches in the fading light, sipping weak coffee or chicory, listening to geese flying overhead. Their cries echoed against the empty sky, a reminder that even the birds knew when it was time to move on. Settlers could not fly south. They stayed, rooted by land and hope, watching those V-shaped flocks vanish into the distance. Some children asked, "Why can't we follow?" The answers varied: duty, land, crops, promises. But the truth was always the same. They had chosen to plant their lives here, and leaving was no longer simple. Yet autumn could deceive. Some years brought days so warm in late October that settlers briefly doubted the warnings. They left coats on hooks, went about chores in shirt sleeves, even laughed at the idea of snow. Then, almost cruelly, a sharp frost would arrive overnight, killing what remained of the garden, cracking the surface of water buckets, and reminding them all that warmth was only a guest passing through. That shock, that sudden bite, was often enough to break illusions. From then on, every task carried urgency. In quiet corners, fears whispered louder. Would the roof leak again? Would the food stretch far enough? Would illness strike when snow blocked the roads to town? Settlers rarely voiced these worries in front of children, but children sensed them anyway. They saw the crease in their father's brow as he counted firewood. They heard their mother sigh when a jar cracked in the cellar. They learned, early, that survival depended not only on strong arms, but on foresight and on luck, that most fragile companion. Still, there was a tenderness to these preparations. A mother tucking dried apples into a sack as if she were storing away sunshine. A father sharpening skates for his children, knowing they might need joy as much as fire. A child folding scraps of fabric, thinking they might become mittens before the snow grew deep. These gestures carried a quiet grace, proof that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about preserving humanity in the midst of hardship. As October faded into November, the air grew sharper, the wind more insistent. Smoke curled from chimneys more often, and the smell of earth gave way to the smell of ash. Settlers rose before dawn and worked until dusk, driven by that invisible clock ticking down to the first great storm. Every evening ended with weary silence, yet also with that same shared wish. Let this be enough. Let it last. For some, it would be. For others, no amount of autumn labor could prepare them for what the prairie would unleash. But in those amber days, with leaves falling and geese overhead, no one knew which fate awaited. They only knew that autumn had spoken, and they had listened as best they could. Hands worked quietly, shaping survival in every motion. The prairie was never conquered by grand speeches or bold gestures. It was endured, season after season, through the work of hands. Not the hands of generals or kings, but of farmers' wives and children, of men who spent their lives bent over earth and tools. By autumn's end, before the first deep snow, these hands became the frontier's most precious tools, preparing not just food and shelter, but the very rhythm of survival. Picture a mother's hands, roughened by lye soap and hours of sewing. They moved in and out of cloth, patching holes that seemed to grow faster than she could repair them. A child's coat passed down from brother to sister, worn thin at the elbows, stitched again and again until the fabric became more patch than original. Each stitch was small, almost invisible, but together they meant warmth when the wind struck. My mother's hands never rested, one woman remembered years later. Even in the lamplight, when we children were drowsy, her needle kept flashing. And think of the father's hands, calloused from plow handles and axe work, now turned to gathering what little could burn. Fingers cracked from cold, pressed grass into knots, stacked corn cobs into neat bundles, lifted and dropped buffalo chips until nails split and bled. They did not stop. One entry in a Nebraska diary reads simply, "Father's hands bled this week. He wrapped them in rags and kept working. We said nothing. To speak of it would have wasted his strength. Even children's hands carried their share. 5-year-olds gathered twigs no longer than pencils, piling them into baskets. Older siblings split kindling, their small palms raw from gripping hatchet handles too heavy for them. Yet pride flickered in their eyes, for these chores meant inclusion in the family's battle against cold. My brother was 7 when he chopped his first load," wrote one settler. Mother wept, not from fear, but from pride. His little hands had joined the circle inside cabins. Hands prepared food in every possible way. Vegetables were sorted, dried, or buried in sand. Apples were sliced thin and strung on strings that crisscrossed the ceiling, the air filling with their sweet, drying scent. Meat was salted, layered in barrels, pressed down by the steady force of a woman's palm. Butter was churned until arms ached, then packed tightly in crocks. Every jar sealed, every lid tightened, every sack tied shut was the work of those hands, working almost like prayers whispered against the storm to come. And there was woodwork. A father would sit by lamplight shaving pieces of wood, not for beauty, but for need. A sled runner, repaired so children could carry loads across snow. A stool leg mended because no one could spare the loss of furniture. Tool handles were sanded smooth, reins oiled and softened, barrels patched with wedges and tar. The hands that shaped these things worked quietly, without complaint, yet in every movement lived the hope that the work would last through one more season. But preparation was not only practical, it was ritual. Every task carried meaning beyond its function. A mother pressing her hand flat across the top of a flour sack was not just checking its weight. She was measuring how long it might stretch, silently calculating meals against weeks. A father who ran his thumb across the edge of an axe blade was not only testing sharpness, he was thinking of wood yet to split, of nights yet to be endured. A child placing quilts in a neat pile was not only stacking blankets, she was answering the silent wish in the room. Let us be ready. Neighbors often shared their labor. It was not unusual to see 2 or 3 families gathering to thresh grain or press cider, the work faster under many hands. Laughter might rise for a moment, though always underlined by urgency. A man might jest about his neighbor's crooked stitches, only to offer his own hands in help. One woman wrote, "We laughed as we worked, but the laughter was thin, as though it knew what was waiting." And then there were the smaller gestures, the ones that slipped beneath notice but carried weight. A mother rubbing her child's hands after chores, trying to return warmth to stiff fingers. A father smoothing a horse's mane, whispering encouragement as though the animal carried not only burdens, but hope. Children tracing patterns on frosted window panes with their fingertips, unaware that those very hands would soon be pressed into harder tasks. These details lingered in memory long after winters passed. Yet autumn's labor was not without its quiet shocks. Some families prepared poorly, whether from inexperience or simple misfortune. A broken wagon wheel meant fewer loads of fuel. A spoiled sack of flour could undo weeks of work. And when hands reached for supplies that weren't there, the dread was sharper than any storm. "I will never forget Mother's face when she found the grain eaten through," wrote a man who was a boy in the 1880s. Her hands trembled on the sack. She tried to smile, but we all knew still, most carried on. One family's scarcity often became another's lesson. Children remembered, and in later years, when their own hands worked the same chores, they worked harder, longer, more carefully. Frontier wisdom was carved into flesh and bone, passed down through the very act of labor. Hands taught hands, stitches taught stitches, until the rhythm of preparation became almost instinct. Evenings told the story best. After the day's work, families gathered close by the stove or fire. Hands held needles, or whittled wood, or mended shoes. They moved slowly, methodically, but never idly. Silence hung in the room, broken only by the hiss of a log or the scratch of thread pulled through cloth. In those moments, one could see clearly. Survival was not a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of hands. Hands that never stopped moving, never stopped shaping the fragile barrier between life and the cold outside. And always, there was love in those hands. Rough, tired, cracked, yes, but loving. A mother's palm on a child's cheek, lingering a moment longer than necessary. A father's touch on his wife's shoulder as he passed behind her, reassurance without words. Even in exhaustion, even in silence, these hands carried tenderness. It was tenderness that stitched patches, that built shelters, that salted meat. Survival was not cold, not mechanical. It was human, deeply so, and it lived in touch as much as in labor. By late autumn, when the first sharp frost stung the air, hands began to ache more often. Joints stiffened, skin split, yet they did not stop. For hands that rested too soon might doom a family to hunger or cold. So they pressed on, day after day, until preparation itself became a kind of lullaby, steady, rhythmic, carrying families toward the long night. Walls and seams held back more than the wind. Long before the first storm came shrieking across the plains, families understood that survival often depended not on what they had, but on what they could keep out. The prairie itself was an ocean of emptiness. Winds raced without obstacle, finding every gap, every crack, every weakness in a home. And so, settlers turned their attention to barriers, those silent defenses against cold, hunger, and despair. The work was quiet. You could walk past a homestead in late autumn and hear only faint sounds. The scrape of a knife cutting strips of cloth, the steady thud of a mallet driving mud into chinks, the soft swish of straw being packed between boards. These were not the loud labors of summer. These were tasks of patience, persistence, and watchfulness. Inside, families created their own small walls. Blankets were hung across doorways to keep precious warmth in one room. Heavy quilts, sometimes layered 3 or 4 deep, turned into makeshift doors. Old coats were nailed over windows, their sleeves still dangling like ghostly arms. Children, curious, traced their fingers along the uneven seams of fabric, whispering to one another as if the quilts themselves could hear. Outside, barriers took other forms. Earth was banked high against cabin walls, packed tightly to keep the wind from sneaking under. Sod was stacked, layer upon layer, until a home looked less like a house and more like part of the earth itself. One family cut blocks of frozen mud and leaned them against the north wall, making a shield that gleamed white when frost coated it. To them, it was not ugliness, but armor. The smallest gaps were often the most dangerous. Settlers stuffed rags into corners where light peeked through. They twisted prairie grass into cords and pressed them into seams. Some even used newspaper, whole sheets glued with flour paste, their black print vanishing beneath frost. One girl remembered standing close to the wall and reading aloud by lamplight the faint words still visible beneath the layers. It was like the house was whispering stories, she said, though the words were backwards and strange. Yet barriers were not only physical. Silence itself became a kind of wall. Families learned quickly that wasted words meant wasted breath, wasted heat. On the coldest nights, people spoke in murmurs, choosing gestures over sentences. A nod to add another log, a glance to signal a child should draw closer to the fire. This quiet was not empty. It was deliberate, another defense against the consuming cold. Still, not every barrier held. Diaries tell of mornings when families woke to find drifts of snow inside the cabin, fine white powder blown through invisible cracks. Children laughed at first, rolling in the snow as if it were a gift. Parents did not laugh. They swept quickly, anxiously, knowing that what slipped in once would return again and again unless the seam was found and sealed. One man wrote, We fought the wind as if it were a clever thief. No matter what we did, it found another way in. The shock of failure was quiet but sharp. Imagine sitting by the stove, the flames glowing low, and feeling a thread of icy air slide against your neck. You turn, press your hand to the wall, and there it is. The enemy has entered. No storm needed. Just one small draft, enough to rob hours of warmth from the family gathered close. Many nights were spent chasing such threads of air, patching, pressing, stuffing, until exhaustion took over. But barriers could be built in spirit, as well as in timber or cloth. Communities often created circles of defense by sheer watchfulness. Neighbors agreed to check on one another when storms came, knocking on doors, making sure fires still burned. It was an unspoken pact. If your chimney went dark, someone would notice. If your door drifted shut with snow, someone would dig. This human wall was perhaps the strongest barrier of all, holding back not the wind, but despair. One story from Dakota Territory tells of a widow who lived with 2 children on the edge of a settlement. Her cabin was poorly built, her walls thin. As winter deepened, neighbors saw the smoke from her chimney thinning. Without waiting to be asked, 5 families gathered, carried quilts, straw, and sod, and surrounded her cabin with a second skin. They worked until their hands bled, never speaking of charity. "We could not let the wind take them," one man wrote later. "So we built another wall with what we had." The widow lived through that winter. Her children grew. The memory of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder stayed longer than any storm. Even animals became barriers. Families brought cows close against house walls, the animal's bulk adding warmth to the human side. Chickens were sometimes placed in baskets at the foot of children's beds, their body heat rising into the quilts. Horses sheltered in lean-tos built tight against cabins, their breathing a steady warmth through the boards. A father once told his children, "This wall breathes, and because it breathes, so do we." And then there was the barrier of faith. Prayers whispered at night, not loud but steady, seemed to create a wall against fear. Psalms recited, lullabies sung, simple words spoken again and again, as if they could hold back the storm. Some families read scripture, others told stories from memory, their voices weaving a net of sound that wrapped around the cabin. When Father read aloud, the wind seemed less cruel. One woman remembered. It was as if his voice filled the cracks the mud could not reach. Yet perhaps the most surprising barrier was hope itself. Even in the coldest hours, settlers held onto small visions, a garden green again, a river running free, the first soft grass underfoot in spring. These thoughts were walls no storm could break, unseen but powerful, binding families together when every other defense seemed fragile. As autumn faded and winter pressed its hand against the windows, the cabin stood ready. Some looked sturdy, thick with sod and lined with quilts. Others looked fragile, patched with whatever could be found. But all carried barriers, of earth, of cloth, of silence, of spirit. They were never perfect. They cracked, they shifted, they failed. And yet, they bought time. They held warmth a little longer. They kept breath alive until morning. Neighbors' lives mirrored hopes and fears of our own. On the open prairie, where the horizon seemed to run forever, and loneliness pressed close as the wind, neighbors were more than companions. They were mirrors. In their lives, families saw reflections of their own struggles, their own choices, their own quiet fears. To survive a winter in that vast, empty place was not only to know your own story, but but to witness it echoed in the cabins and sod houses nearby. It began in autumn, before the storms. Men exchanged nods across fields as they loaded wagons with fuel, each glance carrying unspoken questions. Have you gathered enough? Will it be enough? Women traded jars of preserves at fence lines, their smiles gentle but edged with the same calculation. And children, though too young to carry such burdens, listened to scraps of talk and measured their family's chances against their playmates. A neighbor's bounty was reassurance. A neighbor's scarcity was a warning. Sometimes reflection meant caution. When the Jensen family built their cabin with wide Eastern-style windows, the Petersons down the road shook their heads. Too thin, they whispered. Too open. The first blizzard proved the Petersons right. Snow drove through the seams, frost laced the panes, and the Jensens shivered through nights that nearly broke them. By spring, they had bricked over those proud windows with sod. Other families took note. No one else built wide windows again. In this way, one family's hardship became a lesson carved into the landscape itself. And yet reflection could also inspire. The Williams family, who had arrived with little but determination, fashioned a sod house that stood firm when others faltered. Its thick walls held warmth, its door faced south to catch the sun, and its roof, though damp and low, never blew away. Neighbors visited and left with new ideas. We saw what could be done, one recalled, and we went home to change what we thought was finished. Thus, the success of one family rippled outward, improving the chances of many. Even in the smallest things, neighbors mirrored one another. A woman walking to the well noticed how another had lined her bucket with cloth to keep water from freezing too quickly. She went home and did the same. A man observed his neighbor banking earth higher against his walls and returned with his shovel to follow suit. Pride had little place in such matters. Imitation was not insult, but praise, a quiet acknowledgement. Your way works. We will do the same. There were darker reflections, too. A family that failed to prepare, whether through misfortune or stubbornness, cast a shadow on everyone nearby. When the Aldriches ran out of fuel one bitter December, neighbors whispered of their miscalculation. But the whispers carried fear, not scorn. For if one family could fall short, could not any? The sight of their smoke dwindling shook others awake, spurring them to count their own stacks again, to gather more while time remained. These reflections did more than shape habits. They shaped hearts. When Minnie Freeman led her school children through the blizzard of 1888, stories of her courage spread across the plains. For weeks afterward, neighbors spoke her name as if it were a charm against despair. Mothers whispered it to daughters. Fathers repeated it to sons. And though few would face such a storm, her example became a lantern, reminding families that courage, too, could be mirrored and shared. Even absence reflected. When smoke failed to rise from a chimney, when no sound came from a barn, neighbors felt the silence like a draft under their own door. They acted. Men harnessed horses and rode through drifts to check cabins. Women baked extra bread, carried it wrapped in quilts, and left it on porches. No one said aloud what everyone knew, that without such reflections of care, the prairie could swallow families whole. Children mirrored each other most tenderly. One boy recalled watching a neighbor girl tie strips of cloth around her doll to make a winter coat. He hurried home and wrapped his toy horse in scraps of flannel. Another child saw his friend's mittens lined with rabbit fur and begged his mother for the same. In their games and imitations, children rehearsed the lessons that would one day mean life or death when they were grown. At times, reflection carried sorrow. When a family buried a child lost to cold or hunger, the grief stretched beyond one household. Neighbors saw themselves in the mourning parents, imagined their own sons or daughters lying beneath the snow. "Every grave dug was dug for us all," wrote one settler. Each loss was a warning written on the earth. These shared sorrows bound communities, knitting them together with threads stronger than geography. But reflection was not always grim. In the midst of hardship, joy echoed too. When one family slaughtered a hog and shared sausage, laughter rose in the cramped warmth of neighbors' kitchens. When children from 3 households gathered to slide down a snowbank, their shouts carried across the frozen fields, reminding weary parents that life could still be bright. Such moments, reflected back and forth, became small hearth fires against the darkness of winter. The prairie itself seemed to echo these reflections. Smoke from chimneys rose in thin parallel columns like lines of verse across the horizon. Paths between houses, trampled by boots and sleds, formed threads binding neighbors together. Lanterns flickered in distant windows, tiny beacons mirroring one another in the vast dark. Each sign of life reassured. "We are here. You are not alone." Perhaps the strongest reflection was generosity. Families who had little still found ways to give. A jar of pickles offered at a doorstep, a handful of kindling shared, a pair of mittens loaned to a child. Such acts mirrored themselves endlessly, passed from house to house until they formed a circle of care. One woman wrote, "I gave bread to my neighbor, and she gave meat to another, and he gave fuel to the widow. None of us gave enough, but together we had plenty." By midwinter, when storms howled and days grew dim, these reflections became lifelines. Families huddled in their cabins, yet their thoughts reached outward. They measured their own warmth by the warmth of others, their own silence by the silence of neighbors. Each household was a mirror, reflecting and receiving the struggles of those around them. And when spring finally came, when snow melted into rivulets and green shoots pushed through frozen ground, neighbors gathered outside once more. They looked into one another's faces, lined with the same fatigue, brightened with the same relief, and saw themselves reflected. Survivors, together. Small kindness opened doors no lock could hold. Winter on the frontier often revealed truths that were hidden in fairer seasons. When the land lay bare and snow erased the familiar paths, kindness became the true currency of survival. It was never announced loudly. No banners waved, no speeches made. Instead, it arrived in the quietest ways. A loaf of bread slipped into cold hands, a lantern carried through the night, a quilt folded and left at a door. These small gestures, humble and often unseen, held the power to turn despair into endurance. In the diaries that remain, you find evidence of this. Not in grand tales of battles or great discoveries, but in the margins. A line about a neighbor who brought coal on a freezing morning. A note of gratitude for a pot of stew shared when rations dwindled. These acts were never recorded with fanfare, but their impact echoed through the lives they touched. For in the silence of winter, even a single kind gesture could feel like a miracle. Take the story of Sarah Aldrich, whose family nearly froze when their fuel ran out in the winter of 1881. When all seemed lost, she sent her children to the Petersons 3 miles away. That desperate act was answered with kindness. The Petersons bundled the family into their home, sharing what little fuel and food they had. "We would have died without them," Sarah later admitted. And yet, the Petersons themselves were not wealthy. They simply chose to open their door. That choice became the key that unlocked another family's survival. Kindness often took the form of labor, given freely when others faltered. Men who had already spent their days splitting logs or hauling hay would hitch their horses again, traveling through drifts to check on neighbors. Women, weary from endless chores, would still find time to prepare an extra loaf or mend a pair of mittens for a child not their own. Each act chipped away at winter's cruelty, reminding families that they did not face the storm alone. Sometimes kindness was disguised as simple watchfulness. Settlers practiced what became known as the winter check. Every morning, neighbors scanned the horizon for signs of life. Smoke from a chimney, footprints near a barn. If none appeared, they would saddle up and ride through the cold, ready to break through snowdrifts to reach those who might be in trouble. One man wrote, "I did not knock for thanks. I knocked to be sure they were still among the living." Such vigilance was not only compassion, it was survival policy. But kindness also flowed in smaller, quieter channels. A jar of preserves shared at a fence line, a pair of wool socks swapped for nothing at all, a neighbor lingering at the door longer than needed, just to offer company to someone bowed beneath grief. These gestures required no great sacrifice, yet they carried immense weight. They told the weary soul, "You are seen. You are remembered. You are not forgotten in this great white silence." One of the more haunting entries comes from the children's blizzard of 1888. Amid the tragedy, stories of kindness shine like faint lanterns in a blizzard. Teachers who wrapped their coats around students. Strangers who took in children wandering through whiteouts, warming them at their stoves without a thought of space or supplies. In one case, a farmer discovered 3 children collapsed near his barn. He carried them inside, one under each arm and another clinging to his back, and laid them by his fire. "We burned our chairs that night," he recalled, "but they lived." The sacrifice of furniture, memories of years carved into wood, was offered without hesitation. Kindness became the flame that outlasted the storm. It is worth noting that kindness was not always sentimental. On the frontier, it was pragmatic, as essential as food or fire. Families often gave because they knew one day they might need the same in return. This was not selfishness, but recognition of interdependence. "We gave fuel to the Johnsons," one settler wrote, "and when our baby was born too soon, they gave us broth and care. Neither of us would have survived alone." In that exchange, kindness functioned as a circulating current, flowing back and forth until it warmed the entire community. Even animals, it seemed, drew kindness from hardened hearts. Many accounts describe families bringing livestock into their homes on the coldest nights, not only to preserve the animals' lives, but also to ease their own. "The chickens roosted above our bed," one woman remembered. "It was foul, but it was life. And in caring for them, we remembered to care for one another." Kindness to creatures softened the edge of bitterness, teaching children that compassion was not selective. Life, any life, was precious in winter. There were, of course, moments when kindness required courage. To leave the safety of one's home in a storm was to risk death. Yet men and women did it again and again, driven by something deeper than duty. One journal tells of a girl who trudged through waist-high snow with a lantern, carrying broth to an elderly neighbor who had fallen ill. "I thought the wind would take me," she wrote later, "but I could not bear the thought of him alone." Her small act, a bowl of broth, carried greater weight than any feast. These stories reveal a quiet truth. Kindness was not an accessory to survival, but its very foundation. Without it, fuel stacks dwindled unnoticed, cellars emptied too quickly, spirits collapsed under loneliness. With it, burdens lightened, hope endured, and winter, though still fierce, became bearable. The key was not hidden in great strength or clever invention. It lay in the willingness to share. Warmth, food, company, time. And in sharing, families discovered something remarkable. The act of giving created its own warmth, intangible yet deeply felt. Neighbors spoke of fires seeming to burn brighter after acts of generosity, as if the walls themselves absorbed gratitude and reflected it back. The room felt warmer, one woman wrote after delivering food to a neighbor. I know the stove burned no hotter, but we all believed it did. In a place where belief could sustain life as surely as bread, that warmth mattered. Today, when we sit in homes insulated and lit, we may forget how much survival once depended on kindness. But on those wide plains, where each storm threatened to erase entire families, kindness was not optional. It was the key that fit every lock, the answer to every question winter asked. And it was not found in distant heroes, but in ordinary people, tired and cold, who still managed to give. Winter's silence often held its loudest lessons. There were nights on the frontier when the quiet itself seemed unbearable. The wind, that constant companion, would die down for a time, and the stillness pressed against cabins like a heavy weight. Families huddled close, not daring to speak above whispers, aware that silence did not always mean peace. Sometimes it meant the storm was only gathering its strength. Other times, silence itself revealed truths more jarring than thunder. Imagine a cabin deep in January, its stove glowing faintly, the last embers banked for the night. The children sleep close to one another, their breath curling in small clouds that rise and vanish in the dim air. The mother rests with her hand draped over the cradle, though the baby inside is thin and restless. Outside, the prairie lies under a skin of ice, stars bright but brittle. And in this fragile stillness, the family hears something new. Not the wind, not the cry of animals, but the absence of sound. The cow that usually shifted in her stall has fallen silent. The dog that barked at shadows no longer stirs. Even the familiar creak of the roof timbers is gone. Such quiet, unnatural and sharp, was enough to make hearts race. The silent shocks of prairie winters came in many forms. Sometimes it was the discovery, come morning, that the water bucket left near the stove had frozen solid despite the fire. Sometimes it was the shock of stepping outside into a world so still that your own breath felt intrusive, the snow muffling every sound until the earth itself seemed to have stopped breathing. And sometimes it was silence within the home, a cough that suddenly ceased, a cry that never came again. The children's blizzard of 1888 carried its own cruel silence. Survivors spoke not of roaring winds alone, but of what followed, the eerie hush when the storm ended. Settlers emerged from snow-buried cabins to a landscape that looked smooth and untouched, as though no living creature had ever walked there. Yet scattered beneath that deceptive stillness were tragedies too numerous to count. Parents searched in near silence, calling out children's names that vanished into the blank air, their voices swallowed before they reached more than a few yards. The quiet after the storm became a sound that haunted them for years. But not every shock was born of loss. Some were quieter miracles. Families told of nights when they believed the fire had gone out, only to uncover in the ashes a single ember still glowing, enough to kindle warmth again. A small orange spark in the gray silence felt like salvation. "We thought it was dead," one man wrote, "but it lived, and so did we." The shock of that survival, the realization that life could persist in the most unlikely places, carried a force stronger than despair. There was the silent shock of kindness, too. A knock at the door after midnight could freeze a family with fear. Who would come through the snow at such an hour? Yet often it was a neighbor, face rimed with frost, carrying wood or broth. No words needed to be spoken. The act itself resounded louder than any voice. Families remembered such nights for decades, their hearts quickened not by danger, but by the jarring contrast between isolation and sudden human presence. The prairie seemed to favor such contrasts. Stillness followed storms, and storms followed stillness. Quiet was never permanent. It was always on the edge of breaking. And so families learned to treat silence as a message. Sometimes a warning, sometimes a reprieve, but never to be ignored. One settler recalled a moment when his wife, rising before dawn, found the cabin colder than she had ever felt. She checked the stove and found only gray ash. Panic spread through her chest like fire. She shook her husband awake, whispering, "It's gone." But when he stirred the ashes gently, a faint glow answered back. That glow, so small it could be mistaken for imagination, became the center of their world. They blew on it carefully, added twigs, and watched the ember flare. "The silence nearly killed us," he wrote, "and then it saved us too." The frontier's quiet climaxes were often private, witnessed only by a handful of people in small, drafty cabins. Yet their impact was as profound as any great historical event. A child surviving a fever through the long hush of night, a horse returning to the barn after vanishing into the storm, a neighbor arriving just in time with food. Each moment seemed to arrive out of nowhere, shocking in its simplicity, transforming despair into gratitude. And then there were the shocks that could not be softened. Diaries mention them sparingly, with the restraint of those who endured too much to put everything into words. A father, waking to find his infant cold and still. A woman, rising to discover her husband's place in bed empty, his footprints leading out into the storm where he never returned. These moments were recorded without embellishment, only the barest lines of ink, yet they carry more weight than pages of detail. The silence of what was left unsaid spoke loudest. Even so, the settlers found ways to carry these shocks forward, weaving them into the fabric of survival. They told stories of the losses not to dwell on them, but to remind the living what vigilance demanded. They told stories of the small miracles to remind each other what hope still offered. And in the retelling, the quiet became less frightening, more bearable, transformed into a teacher rather than an enemy. To sit in a warm room now, in a world where silence is rare, is to forget how heavy it can be. Yet in those cabins, where every creak mattered, silence was a presence. It could comfort or terrify, shock or soothe. The frontier families learned to listen to it, to read its messages as carefully as they read the stars or the patterns of snow. And in that listening, they found a strange resilience, the ability to face not only the storms that screamed, but also the nights that whispered nothing at all. Through the snow, lives mirrored each other in struggle. After the loudest storms, the prairie fell into a listening hush, and in that hush, people began again to look outward. Not far. No one gazed to the horizon and dreamed of distant cities when the stove needed feeding, but outward enough to find other lights. You could stand at a frosted window at dusk and count the living by their lanterns. One small square of gold at the Petersons, a wobbling oval at the Jensens where the wind tugged the curtain, two stubborn points at the Williams place because they kept a candle near the barn door for luck. On long winter evenings, those faint lights were a kind of census. Here, 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 we are still here. Seeing a neighbor in winter was not the same as visiting in summer. Summer meetings had chatter and dust and the bright clatter of harness. Winter's meetings were mostly in the eyes. You might pass a figure bent low against the wind, both of you wrapped to the nose. And in that quick glance you measured things. The angle of the shoulders, the pace on the snow, whether the frost gathered thick on the scarf. A raised mitten meant, "I'm managing." A brief tap on the hat brim meant, "I see you, too." These were old country courtesies remade for a place that could take your breath if you wasted it on words. From the road, you could tell which houses had built right for the season. The thin-boarded Eastern-style cabins wore rime like cracked glass. The smoke from their stovepipes thinned too quickly, racing into the air as if the cold were drinking it. The sod houses looked squat and unbeautiful, but the smoke rose slow and blue from their pipes, hanging like a ribbon before the wind pulled it away. One man, moving through a silver morning with a sack of corn over his shoulder, paused to study the two smokes side by side and shook his head. "A pretty house is a cold house," he murmured, and stepped on. People learned by looking. The Olsons noticed the Williams door faced south and made a note to turn their own, come spring, even if it meant moving the whole frame by handspike and prayer. The Johnsons saw quilted curtains hung a second layer deep at the Millers and stitched their own from coats too small for anyone now. A boy, sent to fetch embers in a lidded pan for his mother's baking, stared at the Peterson stovepipe and saw it bent at an odd, sensible angle, their draft no longer bullied by the wind, and carried that picture home like treasure. "Sometimes we did not exchange a word," a woman wrote later. "We took our lessons with our eyes and paid with a nod." There were other kinds of sight. In some settlements, the morning watch became a habit no one announced. The first pair awake scanned the distance for smoke. If a chimney stayed bare too long, men saddled up or shouldered a sled and went. A rag tied to a latch could mean, "Bring a doctor." A lantern hung high outside at noon, when no light was needed, meant, "We are short of fuel." In hard years, little codes flowered like winter weeds, useful, plain, and born of need. Once, after a whiteout that smothered paths and walled doors, 3 households agreed on a simple signal. A kettle set on the sill when all was well, turned mouth down when help was wanted. You could walk the track between and read a street of kettles as if it were a newspaper. Footpaths stitched the settlement into a quilt. Narrow, tamped-down lanes ran from house to barn, barn to well, house to house. The first storm erased them. The first clear day redrew them with careful boots and sled runners. Children learned to keep to the threads, dragging willow switches along the edges to mark turns that would vanish after the next drift. Sometimes the paths forked in quiet kindness. One line to the widow's place, so her door did not grow lonely with snow. Another to the couple whose boy had gone to town and not yet returned. These tracks were a map of attention more than geography. Now and then, the seeing turned to a soft shock. One pale morning, the Jensen stovepipe held no smoke at all. The sky was clean as bleached bone, and the cold bit without drama, the worst kind. The watchman on the north side, the title was nothing, just a habit, waited the length of a prayer, and then moved. He rapped once, twice, then pushed the door, which gave too easily. Inside the air felt wrong, quiet in a thick way. The fire lay dim as a fading eye. The family sat propped as if resting, colorless, heavy with sleep that wasn't sleep. He did not shout. He went to the window instead, found the latch rimed shut, and kicked it clear. Cold came hard like medicine. He pulled the stovepipe free, black snow falling from its mouth, and propped the door wide with a chair. After a long minute, the room breathed again. When the mother stirred, she whispered, puzzled, "Is it morning?" The watchman nodded and said only, "It is." Later, when the pipe was brushed and set back, he pointed to a coffee tin and a hand saw. "Cut it. Make a short pipe with holes and hang it high by the window," a crude vent learned by watching a cousin's place after a blow-in. The Jensens kept their windows cracked a finger's width for the rest of the winter, and their lantern stayed in the window after dawn for a week as a wordless thank you. Neighbors noticed other small things that guided the season. A chicken crate moved beside a child's bed meant, "We are sharing heat." A quilt fastened like a wall across the kitchen meant, "We are shrinking the house to something we can warm." A pair of mittens hung by the stoop, one ragged, one whole, meant a swap had been made and pride set aside. A fresh broom bundled from Willow meant someone had the strength to keep the snow from piling at the door. These were not announcements. They were disclosures, quiet, ordinary, and full of meaning. Sometimes the seeing turned to humor, dry as a winter cough. The Petersons were proud of their new stove and boasted with a wink that it could burn almost anything short of a hymn book. The next week, a loaf of blackened bread appeared on their stoop, wrapped with a note, "For your stove's education." Even in the stern months, laughter had a way of warming what logs could not. Children made snowmen with twig broom arms and buffalo chip buttons and called them town elders. The elders, passing, pretended offense and stood straighter, which raised another round of giggles. These small jokes were public property, belonging to everyone within sight of the joke and the smoke it rose on. There was learning, too, that came from mistakes you watched other people bravely keep. The thin-walled cabin at the far edge, the one everyone muttered about, made it through a cruel snap because its family braided grass into heavy plats and stacked them between studs like rough quilts. You could see the new wall from the lane, a tuck and a bulge under the winter light. The trick spread. By the next week, 3 more houses wore grass girdles, and no one said, "We got it from them." Pride was an indoor plant, and winter kept the windows frosted. Seeing also meant being seen. On a late afternoon, when the sky sagged close and a whisper of weather promised more, the Williams girl trudged to the well, lantern caged and steady. Halfway back, the flame went thin. She cupped the glass, but the wind slid its cold fingers under her wrists. In front of her, the path crossed the lee of the Peterson shed, a small haven. She stepped into that pocket of quiet to relight, and in the glass she caught another flame, a neighbor's lantern, already lifted, already offering its sheltering light to walk inside of. For a long moment, the 2 lanterns made a tiny chapel door on the snow, and she passed through it, head bowed, without knowing. When she reached home, her mother touched her cheek, found the skin burning from cold, and said nothing, because the girl's expression was already full. With what? Relief, maybe, or a new way of sizing the world, light to light. There were nights when the entire settlement seemed to breathe together. Through chinks and seams, through keyholes and the clumsy mouths of stovepipes, warmth lifted and thinned and drifted. You could stand on the rise by the schoolhouse and watch a half-dozen ribbons of smoke turn the same soft color at sundown. If you were given to such thoughts, you might say the place had one long exhale. If you were practical, you'd simply count the ribbons and say, "Good, that's all of us." Not everything seen was comforting. A trail that ended mid-drift scraped the nerves raw. Men learned to carry willow branches, jabbing them into the snow every 20 steps on bad days, so anyone behind could follow a line of small green hands reaching up. Where the branches stopped, boots stopped, and so did talk. The answer was usually simple: a stumble, a loop, a path regained farther on. But that first stare into the blind white was the kind of silence everyone remembered. Later, over a shared pot, it might be retold as a narrow thing, the way such stories are softened. We nearly turned back. The horse snorted and found the track. I sang to keep my legs honest. The listening faces would nod and look pleased without smiling much, as if relief were a delicate thing that might bruise if handled roughly. Births were seen from a distance, too, with signals as old as any church bell. 2 candles in the front window at noon meant a child had come and the house was asking for light to meet light. Women arrived with broth, with clean cloth, with hands that smelled of soap and flour. They hung their shawls on pegs, sat close, and made a gentle circle of talk, while the new life found its breath. Men, meanwhile, pretended to be busy with doors and hinges and the noble work of filling wood boxes, because a newborn's cry could put tears in even the driest eyes, and men liked to blame smoke for that. And when a life ended, the seeing grew careful. Curtains were drawn, and a single lantern burned regardless of hour. Paths to that door were kept clean without remark. At supper, an extra bowl might be filled and carried across with a knock that did not wait. Children were told to play their shouting games farther off. In a place where sound traveled clean and bone deep, respect was a quiet craft everyone learned by sight. Everything we knew came by looking, a woman wrote late in life. We watched the snow teach the roofs, watched the wind teach the doors, watched the faces teach each other. If you could not watch, you could not stay. She told of the year they adopted the Olson way of banking earth, the Miller habit of setting a chair by the door to remind children to sit while boots thawed, the Johnson practice of keeping a small tin of ashes by the stove for banking coals, so the morning did not begin with dread. None of these were laws. They were lanterns hung where others could see. Even the animals were part of this public reading. A horse standing with its rear to the wind, a red cow lying down before the barometer dropped, a dog scratching at a crack where draft sneaked in. Living barometers, all of them, and neighbors watched each other watching them. The boy who noticed first and laughed with the reckless pride of noticing. The old man who nodded and did not laugh, because for him the noticing was not a trick, but a habit that had lengthened his years. By late winter, the sight lines felt like kinship. You knew the particular tilt of your neighbor's hat from a quarter mile. You could tell the Peterson girl by the way she turned her lantern low when crossing open snow, cupping it like a secret. You could recognize the Williams boy by the purposeful lift of his knees when breaking trail, the march of someone who had been praised once and meant to deserve it again. To know people by sight and sign was to be bound to them, and the binding was a comfort greater than cloth. When the thaw finally offered its first rumor, the drip we call a promise, folks still watched. They looked for smoke less often and for water more. A dark line under a south wall, a rivulet talking to itself by the woodpile, a splotch on the barn door where sun had out-argued frost. Faces turned toward faces, too, and the winter reading gave way to spring talk, which is always a gentler language. Someone would remark that the sod roofs were growing tufts again, that the chickens had found courage enough to scratch in the bare places, that a child's cough had quieted. The watchers pocketed their watching for another year, the way you fold a clean handkerchief and keep it ready. What remains is a memory of seeing and being seen. Those lights across the snow, small and stubborn, were not just proof of life. They were instruction and invitation. They taught neighbors to borrow good ways without shame and to lend better ones without pride. They invited the fearful to look up from their own hands and find another pair working in the same dim glow. In a land that could whisper you into loneliness, the sight of a window alive at midnight was a sentence worth learning by heart. You are not alone. In the hush of winter, stories slipped between homes like embers. When the wind fell quiet and the lamps glowed steady, another kind of fuel took its turn. Words, soft and measured, wandered from hearth to hearth. They did not always travel on paper or in letters, though some families clutched at thin envelopes with trembling hands, but more often in memory, passed from one mouth to another, like coals carried carefully across dark fields. In those hours, stories did for the spirit what buffalo chips did for the stove, kept the chill from creeping all the way in. Imagine the room first. Low ceiling, the lantern hooked to a nail, shadows breathing on the walls. A kettle ticks and sighs. The children have pulled themselves close to the stove, not because they are listening, but because listening is the only way left to be still when the cold presses at the door. A mother, her hands red with work, lifts her eyes from mending and says, almost to herself, "Did I ever tell you about the day the river froze so fast it caught the geese standing?" The smallest boy frowns, already half believing. And so a thread begins. These stories were not always grand. Some were simple recollections. How grandfather walked 10 miles with frost nipping at his boots to fetch medicine. How a neighbor once burned her bread because the storm roared louder than the oven's hiss. How one year the snow stacked so high they dug tunnels from house to barn, children laughing even as mothers worried. Each tale was an ember, small, ordinary, but bright enough to glow in the gloom. Retold night after night, they grew polished like stones in a river, worn smooth by memory's passing hand. Sometimes the tales carried warning. Parents who had watched neighbors lost to storms spoke softly so the lesson might root without frightening. "Stay on the path," they would whisper, for a boy once wandered, and though the barn was near, he circled until the snow closed around him. Eyes would widen, mittens pulled tighter. The story lingered longer than a scolding would have, shaping careful habits when the next storm came. In this way, fear became folded into memory, like a bitter herb mixed into broth, healing in its own quiet way. There were stories of kindness, too, which warmed more deeply than any stove. Families spoke of neighbors who gave their last measure of fuel, or the woman who cut her quilt in two so another child might sleep beneath it. Told again in February, when tempers frayed and stores grew thin, these accounts reminded everyone that generosity was not spent in one act. It returned like the seasons. A man who shared his wood one winter might receive bread the next, without either keeping tally. These stories soothed the sharp edges of hunger and taught that survival was not arithmetic, but a kind of shared hymn. A curious thing, winter stripped the stories of decoration. They were not told to impress, but to endure. A fiddler in town might sing long ballads in summer, rolling with rhyme and flourish, but in January, the same man sat by a stove and spoke plainly. "I once slept 3 nights in the hay, with only a lantern for heat," he'd say, "and I woke each morning grateful for the breath in my chest. No embellishment, no grand gesture, only the core of endurance. And somehow, those plain words settled heavier in the heart than any tune." Letters, when they came, were stories in paper form, carried weeks through snowbound routes. A page from a brother back east, telling of orchards asleep under gentler winters, could make a whole room fall silent. The reading was often done aloud, each sentence a bead strung for all to touch. Even the children, who understood little, felt the weight in the pauses, the catch in a parent's throat. These fragile sheets, creased and thumbed until they tore, became family treasures, held close like talismans against the long dark. One winter, the Johnsons received a letter from an uncle who had stayed behind in Vermont. He wrote of tapping maples, of the sweet steam rising, of horses stamping in soft barns. "The snow is thick but friendly," he wrote. "Not the cruel kind, you know." For weeks after, the Johnson children spoke of friendly snow, trying to imagine it. They pressed their faces to the glass, looking out at the hard white drifts, and laughed at the thought that snow could ever be kind. The letter did not change the weather, but it softened the way they met it, with a touch of humor, which is its own shield. Not all stories were for comfort. Some slipped from lips tired with sorrow. A mother staring into her hands might recall the winter when her first child did not wake. She would not weep as she spoke. Tears froze too quickly, but her voice would flatten into the steady tone of someone placing stones one by one. Children shifted uneasily, sensing both the sadness and the strength beneath it. Such confessions, rare and heavy, taught that grief was a companion on the frontier, but not one that silenced life. To speak loss aloud was to weave it into the tapestry rather than let it tear a hole. Neighbors shared stories as currency, traded across doorsteps when errands carried them abroad. "Did you hear?" someone would murmur, breath clouding the air, "that the Olsons learned to pack snow against their north wall?" Another nodded and replied, "And the Millers, they've started burning twisted hay when chips ran out." These were not just tips, but narratives, framed in the rhythm of lived experience. To pass on a technique was to pass on the story of the moment it saved. By the time it reached a fourth household, the telling might be brief, but the ember still glowed. Even in the darkest hours, humor threaded through the tales, a brittle but shining cord. Families told of calves born in storms that tried to stand on ice, or of hens who refused to lay unless sung to. Laughter rose, quiet but stubborn, against the roof beams. It was a laughter of defiance, the kind that says, "We are cold, yes, but still human." Those chuckles, shared across quilts and chipped mugs, reminded settlers that their spirits had not been buried by snow. One evening during the hard winter, a traveling minister passed through and gathered families in the schoolhouse. There was no sermon that night, only stories. Each man and woman stood in turn and gave a memory. The worst night survived, the smallest mercy received. The minister said little, only nodded, but when all were done, he observed, "You've built a scripture among yourselves." The words lingered. For many, those community nights were the closest thing to church they would have for months, holy not because of doctrine, but because survival itself had become the shared creed. And so, night after night, the stories circled like sparks. They reminded children not to stray, reminded mothers to ration carefully, reminded fathers that pride bent too stiffly could snap in the wind. They wove grief with gratitude, hardship with humor. They were not bedtime fables in the usual sense, yet they worked the same magic, slowing breathing, steadying hearts, coaxing the mind to accept that even in bitter landscapes, warmth could be found in words. The cold pressed hard at the walls, but inside, sentences glowed like embers that refused to die. When supplies ran thin, hands found quiet ways to invent warmth. Ingenuity was not a loud thing on the frontier. It did not announce itself with trumpets or triumph. It appeared in the smallest gestures, the quietest adjustments, often in moments when no one else was watching. In the heart of those winters, invention was less about progress than persistence. It was about finding ways to stretch one more day of warmth, one more meal, one more breath of hope. Picture a cabin deep in February. The snow outside has drifted so high it blurs the horizon, the path to the barn nearly erased. Inside, the father examines the dwindling pile of fuel. Only a scatter of buffalo chips remains, not enough for the week ahead. He takes apart a broken chair, not out of carelessness, but out of survival, feeding one leg to the stove while setting aside the others for later. The smell of old wood rises with the heat, and in that quiet act of sacrifice, the cradle one winter, the table another, ingenuity takes root. Every object was measured not by sentiment, but by how long it might keep children's fingers from stiffening with cold. Mothers became alchemists of scarcity. With cellars thinning, they stirred thin soups that stretched scraps into something resembling supper. A sliver of salt pork, diced so fine it dissolved into broth, flavored a whole pot. A handful of dried apples simmered until they plumped, turning into dessert for 6, even if each portion was no larger than a spoonful. They learned to thicken thin stews with flour dust or crushed roots, to turn spoiled potatoes into feed for animals, keeping livestock alive through weeks when grass lay buried. These tricks, born from desperation, grew into knowledge passed from one household to another until entire communities carried the same repertoire of small miracles. Children, too, joined the quiet invention. With no toys but their imaginations, they pressed snow into shapes, built tunnels and forts that doubled as play and practice for survival. In some families, older children learned to braid prairie grass into tight twists, dried in bundles, used as fuel. Their small hands were quicker, more nimble, turning weeds into warmth. It was a kind of apprenticeship, not in trade or craft, but in survival itself. A boy who once braided grass for the stove grew into a man who measured walls by how well they held wind at bay. Neighbors shared innovations as eagerly as food. One family discovered that hanging wet clothes above the stove on carefully placed poles both dried the garments and added precious humidity to the air, preventing lips from cracking and eyes from burning in the endless dryness. Another family pressed clay into gaps between logs, finding it held better than rags. Word of these solutions spread like lantern light across the prairie. If one cabin survived a storm with fewer losses, others wanted to know how. In a place where mistakes carried a price measured in fingers or lives, ingenuity was never kept secret. Some of these inventions looked peculiar to outsiders. Settlers burned corn cobs long after the kernels were eaten, producing a flame that smoked but still warmed. They stitched together clothing from layers that seemed mismatched. Quilts turned into coats, curtains remade as shawls, flour sacks cut and resewn into children's undergarments. Pride bowed low before need. Better patched than frozen, one mother told her daughter, showing her how to quilt old skirts into a blanket thick enough to keep 2 children alive through a blizzard. Such sayings became family mottos, wisdom disguised as plain speech. There were stranger methods still, born of listening to the land. Some settlers carried heated stones from the fire and wrapped them in cloth, slipping them under quilts at night. Others dug shallow pits inside their cabins, lined them with ash and hot coals, and covered them with boards to create heated floors. These makeshift innovations warmed bodies through the long hours when stoves could not keep pace with the wind. They borrowed from native traditions, from memories of Europe, from sheer necessity. No idea was too humble if it worked. Even the smallest adjustment could mark the difference between despair and endurance. A mother who figured out that cabbage kept longer if hung root side up in the cellar. A father who angled his barn doors against the prevailing wind to stop snow from filling stalls. A boy who learned to wrap his hands in rabbit skins instead of cotton gloves, saving his fingers one January morning. Each of these moments was quiet, uncelebrated, yet in hindsight, they glitter like beads strung on the thread of survival. The diary of one Nebraska woman captures this rhythm of invention. "We tried this and failed," she wrote in 1883. "We tried again, and it held. The wind teaches better than books. What does not work one night will be abandoned the next. What holds, we keep and pass along." Her words show ingenuity not as brilliance, but as stubborn attention, a willingness to keep listening, keep adjusting, until the prairie itself seemed to nod in reluctant approval. And it wasn't just physical needs ingenuity addressed. Families devised rituals to soothe fear, games to keep children from dwelling on the hunger or cold. They carved checkerboards into barn planks, whittled dolls from sticks, braided scraps of cloth into balls. These diversions were not luxuries. They were necessary tools for keeping spirits steady through the long confinement of winter. A child distracted with a game was a child less likely to cry from cold, and the quiet that followed gave parents strength to continue. Looking back now, it is tempting to see these inventions as quaint, even charming. But at the time, they were acts of survival, each as sharp and serious as a blade. To invent on the frontier was not to dream of the future, but to wrestle a few more hours from the present. Ingenuity was not measured in patents or profits, but in the breath of a sleeping child, in the warmth of a room that did not quite freeze, in the simple fact of waking to another dawn. Even the strongest households carried quiet fragilities through winter. For all the ingenuity and endurance the frontier demanded, every cabin held shadows that could not be easily banished. Vulnerability seeped through cracks just as the wind did, settling in corners, in whispers, in moments when even the most stoic father or tireless mother found themselves staring at the fire too long, as if willing it not to fade. Winter tested not only walls and supplies, but the fragile human spirits inside them. Picture a household where preparations had been careful, cellar stocked, fuel gathered, clothing layered with care. Outwardly, such a family seemed fortified against the cold. Yet inside, vulnerabilities took subtler shapes. A child too young to understand rationing who cried for more bread. An elderly parent whose hands could no longer carry kindling to the stove. A mother's quiet fear, not of storms, but of silence stretching too far, pressing her mind into restless worry. These were the unseen fractures, small but dangerous, which could widen under pressure. One settler's journal describes the toll of darkness as keenly as the cold. "The night falls too early," he wrote in January of 1882. "The hours lengthen beyond counting. We mend clothes until our eyes ache, then sit with nothing but our own thoughts, which grow sharp as knives. My wife weeps sometimes, though she says it is only the smoke. I do not correct her." His words remind us that even well-prepared cabins bore the strain of isolation, of minds pressed inward with no release. Children, in their way, bore vulnerabilities that adults often overlooked until too late. Without sunlight or freedom to roam, their energy coiled tight. They quarreled, they sulked, they grew restless. Parents told stories not only to instruct, but to keep tempers from unraveling. Sometimes, though, the restlessness broke through. A boy might insist on running outside without full layers, only to return with cheeks white from frostbite's early touch. A girl might sneak to the root cellar for more dried apples, throwing off carefully balanced rations. Each misstep, born of childhood impulse, carried weight far heavier than it would in gentler climates. Health itself was a shadowy vulnerability. Small illnesses, so trivial in summer, became threats when bodies were weakened by cold and poor diet. A cough might linger, a fever burn, with no doctor near and no medicine left. Families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, prayers whispered over beds, but often it was endurance alone that decided outcomes. A mother wrote of losing her infant to lung fever in the winter of 1879, not for lack of love or vigilance, but because no amount of tending could compete with the bitter air that seeped even into the cradle. Her grief, recorded in ink that trembled across the page, reveals the harsh truth. Survival was never complete, and vulnerability always waited. Even pride itself could be a liability. Some fathers refused to accept help from neighbors, determined to stand as independent providers. But winter punished pride as swiftly as carelessness. More than one story tells of men who dismissed offers of fuel or food, only to find themselves forced to beg when supplies failed. Communities remembered such moments not with judgment, but with sorrow, for they understood that the hardest battle was often against one's own stubbornness. Vulnerability, when hidden, could be deadlier than when acknowledged. There were also vulnerabilities of the heart, rarely spoken of in the records, but evident between the lines. Long winters pressed marriages into silence or strain. Couples who once shared laughter found themselves speaking only of chores, rations, and storms. A small misunderstanding, under such pressure, could swell into bitterness. Yet the opposite could happen too. Hardship sometimes bound families tighter, revealing tenderness in gestures as small as a husband warming stones for his wife's bed, or a wife saving the last dried apple for her husband's supper. Both outcomes grew from the same soil of vulnerability, showing how fragile and how resilient human bonds could be. Neighbors carried their own quiet fragilities. The loss of livestock, a failed root cellar, or the simple accident of a broken leg on ice could strip away the thin veil of security. In such moments, the settlement itself became the shield. Families who had only enough for themselves still found ways to share, aware that misfortune could strike anyone. Yet even the community had limits, and when too many households faltered at once, the collective fabric stretched thin. Vulnerability, like the cold, was never evenly distributed, but always shared. The harshest vulnerabilities were sometimes invisible until the thaw revealed them. A homestead that seemed intact in February might be discovered in March with its inhabitants gone, overcome silently by illness, despair, or exhaustion. Neighbors would find stores untouched, fuel stacked, everything in order except for the absence of life. These discoveries whispered a truth that haunted the survivors, that even careful preparation could not guard against every shadow. Winter took what it wished, sometimes gently, sometimes cruelly, always reminding those who remained of their own fragile thread. And yet, within these shadows of vulnerability, there was also an undercurrent of grace. Families who acknowledged their weaknesses learned to lean on one another more tenderly. Settlements that admitted their fragilities developed stronger bonds. Vulnerability, once shared, became less a danger and more a bridge, an opening for compassion, for understanding, for the quiet courage of helping and being helped. It was in those moments that the frontier spirit softened, becoming not just about survival, but about belonging. Within quiet cabins, resilience often stirred unseen until the storm pressed hardest. Strength on the frontier rarely announced itself. It did not wear medals or stand atop hills with banners flying. More often, it whispered in the dimness of a sod house, in the soft patience of a mother coaxing a fire back to life, in the steady rhythm of a father's boots carrying fuel from the drifted barn. These hidden strengths became the lifelines of families during the harshest winters, concealed until necessity revealed them. Imagine the small windowless cabin, walls crusted with frost, the air so heavy with breath that every sound seemed muffled. The storm outside batters the roof, snow piling higher against the door. Within, the family's spirits sag. Hunger gnaws, cold creeps, and silence threatens to unravel the fragile sense of hope. It is here that hidden strengths often awaken. A child, sensing the despair in her parents' eyes, begins to sing a lullaby she half remembers. Her voice is thin, wavering, yet it pulls smiles from weary faces. The song does not change the storm, but it changes the room. That, too, is strength. Strength might appear in the form of improvisation. A mother, noticing the dwindling fuel, gathers dried corn cobs, twisting them with grass to form makeshift logs. Her fingers bleed from the work, but her determination keeps the stove glowing just enough. She says little, offers no speech, yet each bundle placed on the fire becomes a testimony to her resolve. In another home, a boy patches the cracks in the wall with mud gathered before the freeze. His hands shake from the chill, but the draft eases, and his family sleeps warmer that night. Such acts rarely enter the history books, but they were the threads that kept families alive. The settlers' hidden strengths often lay in the refusal to surrender to despair. A diary from Minnesota tells of a father who lost his crop to an early frost. With his food stores halved, he faced winter with fear. Yet each evening, he told his children stories of summers yet to come, of seeds that would sprout, of rivers that would thaw. His children believed him, their trust unshaken, and in their belief, he found the strength to keep tending the fire, to keep rationing carefully, to keep hoping. That cycle of hope, fragile yet persistent, was itself a form of survival. Neighbors, too, revealed hidden strength in moments of crisis. When one family's roof collapsed under snow, a dozen hands arrived within hours, braving the bitter air to rebuild. No one asked how long the help would last, or whether they might be repaid. Strength here lay not in physical endurance alone, but in generosity, extended without question. One woman wrote of the night her husband failed to return from checking livestock. The neighbors lit lanterns and walked the drifts, calling his name until dawn. They found him at last, half buried but alive. I knew then that our strength was not only within us, but around us. Hidden strength sometimes took the form of acceptance. On the harshest nights, when no fire could fully chase away the cold, families drew close together, pressing bodies for warmth, understanding that their only defense was togetherness. A father holding his child against his chest, sacrificing his own comfort for the little one's warmth, carried a strength no one could measure. A mother soothing her children with stories, even as she shivered, held a strength of a different sort. Even the land itself demanded a hidden strength, patience. Winters seemed endless, the calendar crawling slowly toward spring. Settlers marked time not by clocks, but by the dwindling shelves in the root cellar, the shortening piles of fuel. Endurance required the strength to wait, to keep believing that thaw would come, that the river would loosen, that green would return to the prairie. Strength was not in fighting the cold alone, but in trusting that seasons turned, even when days seemed identical, white upon white. And sometimes hidden strength revealed itself through failure. A man who admitted he could not feed his family, who walked to a neighbor's door and asked for help, demonstrated courage equal to any soldier's. Pride bent, but life endured. That bending, that humble strength, often made the difference. Communities grew stronger because of such admissions, weaving together the fragilities of each household into a fabric that no storm could tear apart. The truth is that much of frontier life rested not on dramatic heroism, but on these quiet strengths: patience, kindness, resourcefulness, the refusal to despair. They were like the hidden roots of prairie grass, unseen beneath the snow, yet holding the soil together through wind and storm. Come spring, the evidence of their endurance would appear in lives preserved, in communities unbroken, in the knowledge that storms could be met and survived again. When the snow deepened, silence grew heavier than the storm itself. There were storms so fierce on the prairie that noise itself seemed to vanish, swallowed whole by the snow. Neighbors described them not only as blizzards, but as a kind of white silence, an emptiness that pressed against the ears, muting the world until only the sound of one's own breath remained. It was a silence unlike any known in warmer seasons, a silence that could comfort or terrify, depending on the heart that listened. Picture a small cabin, its walls sodden with frost, lantern light flickering against earthen walls. Outside, snow drives across the open plain in waves. For hours, the howl of wind has battered the roof, rattled the shutters, roared in the chimney. Then suddenly, without warning, the wind drops. The snow still falls, thick and heavy, but in eerie quiet. A hush settles. A child stirs awake and asks, "Has it stopped?" The father listens and shakes his head. "No, my dear. This is only the silence inside the storm." Settlers often spoke of that silence in their journals. One farmer wrote in 1886, "It is worse than the wind. With the wind, one knows the storm is alive, moving. With the silence, one begins to think it has come to stay forever." That stillness seeped into the spirit, magnifying loneliness, stirring doubts. Could they last another day, another week? Was spring truly waiting, or had the earth closed them in for good? The silence carried practical dangers too. Without the roar of wind, families sometimes misjudged the storm's strength. A man might think it safe to walk to the barn, only to vanish into snow so thick he could not see his own outstretched hand. Many who perished during blizzards were found shockingly close to their homes, sometimes only yards from the door, lost in a white silence that erased all landmarks and muffled all cries for help. And yet, within the cabin, the silence could also be strangely soothing. After days of endless wind, families sometimes welcomed the lull, drawing closer to the stove, savoring the illusion of peace. A mother might take that moment to hum softly as she stirred a pot of thin soup. A child, exhausted by fear, might drift back to sleep against his sister's shoulder. The quiet became a fragile reprieve, even as it hid the storm's ongoing fury. Neighbors told stories of emerging after such silences to find a world transformed. Barns buried to their roofs, paths erased, fences vanished beneath drifts taller than a man. One family described opening their door to a wall of snow, the daylight gone, their home entombed in white. For 3 days they tunneled through with pots and spoons until air at last rushed in. The silence had seemed eternal, but survival proved otherwise. The white silence was more than weather. It was a state of mind. It stripped away distractions, leaving only thoughts, memories, and fears. Some settlers dreaded it more than the cold, for in that stillness, the mind turned inward. Long-forgotten griefs resurfaced, worries multiplied, and tempers sometimes frayed. A wife might remember the family she left behind in Ohio, wondering if she would ever see them again. A husband might brood over failed harvests or debts unpaid. Silence did not soften such worries, it sharpened them. Yet not every thought born of silence was grim. Some settlers found in it a rare chance for reflection. Without wind or chores, families might talk more gently, share stories of home, sing hymns together. One diary recalls a father taking that quiet to recite verses he remembered from childhood, words his children had never heard. The silence gave space for tenderness, for remembrance, for the weaving of bonds that storms could not break. The silence, too, carried lessons. It taught settlers that survival was not only a matter of strength and supplies, but of patience. One could not rush a storm, nor force the thaw. One had to wait, endure, and trust. As one woman wrote in 1879, "I learned that silence is not death. It is only another face of winter, and we must sit with it, as we do with the cold, until it passes." So the white silence lingered, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. It pressed against walls, muffled the cries of livestock, made the world seem suspended. And within that hush, hidden strengths revealed themselves: patience, hope, the quiet courage of waiting together. In the hush of winter, bravery often arrived without words or witnesses. Not all courage wears a uniform or carries a rifle. On the frozen prairie, courage often showed itself in the smallest, quietest acts, moments that might go unnoticed by the world at large, yet meant survival for a family huddled against the cold. These acts rarely made headlines or filled books, but they were as necessary as food, as steady as firelight, and as brave as any deed performed on a battlefield. Imagine a mother rising in the pre-dawn dark, her breath visible in the gloom of a sod house. The rest of her family still sleeps, wrapped in quilts, stiff with frost. She slips from the bed, shoulders aching, feet numb, and kneels by the stove. The fire has nearly died. She coaxes a spark from buried embers, feeds it dried cobs and twists of hay, shields the glow with her hands until flame flutters alive again. No one applauds her, no one sees. But that single act of tending fire is an act of courage, for it preserves not just warmth, but the promise of another day. Sometimes courage was found in the children. A boy of 9 trudging into knee-deep drifts to gather chips of frozen dung for fuel, his small arms dragging a basket heavy for his size. He knows the cold burns at his cheeks, that his mittens are worn through, yet he presses on. His father might be too ill, his mother too, burdened with younger siblings. The boy's silent errand, unnoticed by history, might keep the fire alive that night. There was courage, too, in restraint. A father staring at dwindling stores of food, measuring flour in his palm. He might hunger fiercely, but he cuts his portion small, passing more to the children. No one praises him, no song is written, yet his sacrifice shapes survival. One settler's diary told of her husband, who ate nothing but thin broth for 3 weeks, so the little ones might have bread. His strength faded, but the children endured. She wrote, "He never called it bravery. He said only, 'It is what a father does.'" Neighbors practiced courage in the way they opened doors, even when supplies were scarce. One family's barn collapsed under snow, crushing their meager hay. Another family, already rationing, gave over half their store. They risked their own winter to keep neighbors' livestock alive. Courage here was not thunderous, not dramatic, but quiet and steady, born of an understanding that no one survived the prairie alone. The storms often demanded physical courage, a man tying a rope around his waist to step into the blizzard in search of lost cattle, knowing each step might be his last. Yet, just as often, courage took subtler forms, choosing to sit still when every nerve screamed to run, choosing to stay indoors when instinct begged to seek help, knowing the storm could swallow a man in minutes. In such restraint lay another kind of bravery, the bravery of patience. Courage also lived in words, spoken softly when fear pressed hardest. A mother whispering a bedtime tale while wind clawed at the shutters. A father teaching his child how to bank a fire, even as his hands shook with cold. These words, gently given, were acts of courage too. They turned despair into lessons, chaos into order, fear into shared understanding. And sometimes, courage looked like laughter. One Minnesota family remembered a blizzard night when their father told a joke as the roof groaned under snow. The punchline made the children giggle, and the sound carried them through the hours until morning. Their father admitted years later that he had been terrified the roof would cave in. But in the moment, his choice to smile, to bring lightness, was courage enough. We often imagine bravery as public, loud, or recognized. On the frontier, it was none of those things. It was a woman stitching mittens by candlelight with frozen fingers. It was a neighbor trudging 2 miles through drifts to check on the elderly couple in the next hollow. It was a child sharing her last apple with a younger sibling. Courage lived quietly, but its echo stretched across generations. A settler once wrote, "Winter strips away illusions. It shows who we are when no one is watching." The prairie did not reward pride or boastfulness. It rewarded the quiet acts of courage that kept fires burning, children warm, and communities bound together. Journeys through, the storm often ended with a doorstep dusted in frost and relief. To leave the cabin in the dead of winter was to gamble with life itself. And yet, people had to go, whether for fuel, food, or livestock. These journeys were measured not in miles, but in heartbeats and breaths, clouding in the frozen air. When the door finally opened again, when boots stomped snow from their soles and a familiar face appeared in the threshold, the return carried a weight so deep it shaped family memory for years. Picture it. A father stepping out before dawn, a rope tied around his waist, the other end fastened to the doorframe. His wife presses the knot once more, hands trembling, as if the firmness of the knot might bring him back safely. Children watch in silence, holding their blankets to their chins. Then the door shuts, the latch falls, and the house feels emptier, colder. The minutes crawl into hours. The storm rages on. Inside, time stretches. A mother tends the stove, but her eyes drift again and again to the door. A child whispers, "Will he come back?" And she replies softly, "He always does." But her hands shake as she stirs the pot, and she bites her lip to keep worry silent. The sound of the wind becomes unbearable. Every gust feels like a threat, every lull like a held breath. Then, perhaps at dusk, a sound, faint scraping at the door, a shuffle, a knock too weak to carry through the howl. The mother rushes to pull the latch. The door cracks open, snow spilling inside. There he stands, frozen beard stiff as wire, eyes red from cold, shoulders bent beneath the weight of a sack. He is half buried in snow, clothes stiff as armor, but alive. The children cheer, though their voices falter at the sight of his pale face. The return is not triumphant. It is ragged. He falls into the room, shakes his hands free of ice, pulls off boots hard as wood. He places the sack on the table, a bundle of firewood, a handful of flour, or maybe only a few branches and scraps. Still, it is treasure, worth more than gold. The family gathers close, the fire flares brighter, and for one night at least, survival feels possible. Settlers wrote often of these returns. One diary in Nebraska tells of a man gone 4 days to fetch supplies from a distant town. His wife feared him dead, already rehearsing how she might manage the children alone. On the 4th evening, she heard the crunch of sled runners in the snow. When the door opened, he collapsed across the threshold, gaunt and frostbitten, but clutching a sack of cornmeal. She wrote, "I wept not for hunger, but for the sound of his boots at the door." The frost itself marked such journeys. Men returned with eyebrows frozen white, hair stiff with ice, clothes rimed with crystals. They looked less like men than like specters walking out of the blizzard, their bodies wrapped in winter's mark. Sometimes even animals bore this strange appearance. Horses returned with icicles in their manes, dogs with frost clinging to their whiskers. The frost was proof of the peril endured, and of the endurance that carried them home. But not every return came as expected. Some were delayed until hope had nearly vanished. A boy sent to fetch water might be gone an hour longer than usual, lost in drifts or slowed by frozen buckets. His mother's heart would pound until the door finally opened and his small figure appeared, cheeks raw with cold. She might scold him sharply, but then draw him into her arms, relief outweighing fear. In other homes, a return brought sorrow instead of joy. A neighbor arriving with grim news, face drawn, hands empty. He had set out with his own father, but returned alone. The prairie claimed many who ventured too far, who misjudged silence for safety or thought daylight enough protection. Their absence left doors that never opened again, chairs that stayed empty at the table, memories frozen into grief. Still, for most families, the rhythm of return, fraught, delayed, but eventual, became a lifeline. Each knock at the door was proof that journeys could end well, that the storm could be endured. These returns carried not only supplies but stories, of snow so deep it swallowed fences, of wolves seen in the distance, of the eerie hush when wind ceased. Children gathered around to listen, their eyes wide, their fear mixed with awe. And always, the frost told its tale. A man stamping his boots, the ice breaking loose in shards. A woman brushing frost from her husband's coat, her fingers tender though her words sharp. A child laughing at the icicles hanging from her father's beard. Frost was the mark of survival, the evidence of the storm worn upon the body like an unspoken medal. These frosted returns became part of family lore. Decades later, grown children would recall the night their father came back from the storm, or the day their mother staggered in with a basket of kindling, face white with ice. They remembered not only the relief, but the way those returns filled the cabin with warmth beyond fire, with gratitude deeper than any feast. Winter taught its lessons not in words, but in nights survived and mornings endured. The frontier had no classrooms in January, no neat chalkboards or tidy lessons. Instead, winter itself was the teacher, stern and relentless. Its curriculum was simple: how to endure. Those who learned quickly survived. Those who faltered often became names remembered only on gravestones weathered by prairie winds. Endurance was not just a skill, it was the measure of life itself. The first lesson was patience. Snow might fall for 3 days without pause, winds screaming like a living thing against the walls. The temptation was to act, venturing out, pressing forward, proving strength against the storm. but endurance often meant stillness, the quiet discipline of waiting. Families learned to remain indoors, to resist panic, to stretch rations and fuel hour by hour until the sky finally cleared. The second lesson was humility. Many arrived from the east, full of confidence in their knowledge of weather and land. They brought fine houses with thin walls, cotton clothes, proud expectations. Winter stripped away pride. It showed that cotton freezes, that thin boards do little against wind, that boasting cannot stop frostbite. To endure meant bowing to wisdom not your own, adopting methods from neighbors, from native peoples, from anyone who had already survived. The third lesson was sacrifice. Endurance demanded choices. Who would eat less? Who would walk further? Who would tend the fire while others slept? A father might go hungry so his children ate. A mother might work her hands raw to patch clothes for everyone else before sewing her own. These were not heroic gestures celebrated in books. They were daily, unremarked acts that carried families through. Endurance also meant living with discomfort. Water in the bucket froze solid each night. Quilts grew stiff with frost. Breath hung in the air like a fog. There was no expectation of comfort, only degrees of coldness less likely to kill. Families learned to measure their lives not in warmth, but in survival. The stove's glow meant another morning. A loaf of bread meant another week. A sack of chips meant one more fire. Perhaps the hardest lesson was resilience of spirit. The body could be wrapped in wool and fur, but the mind had to face the endless dark and silence. Children longed for spring fields, mothers for gardens, fathers for soil soft beneath their plows. Winter offered none of that, only gray sky and frozen ground. To endure meant finding sparks of light, a story told by lamplight, a song sung while mending clothes, laughter coaxed from tired lips. These small embers kept despair at bay. One family in Dakota recalled a winter where their cellar spoiled. Potatoes rotted, apples shriveled, grain eaten by mice. They faced hunger sharper than cold. Yet each night they gathered around the fire, telling the same stories again and again. The stories filled our bellies, the daughter wrote years later. We were still hungry, but we were not empty. Endurance sometimes meant holding hope when food was gone, finding nourishment in memory and faith. Communities, too, learned endurance as a shared lesson. When storms cut off travel for weeks, neighbors checked smoke from each other's chimneys. They cleared paths through drifts, not for themselves, but for the old and frail. They pooled resources, sacrificing privacy and pride to keep everyone alive. The endurance of one family became tied to the endurance of all. Endurance left marks, of course. Frostbitten fingers that never bent again. Toes blackened and lost. Faces weathered by wind long before their years. Yet many settlers carried these scars with quiet pride. They were proof of lessons learned, proof that winter's tests had been faced and passed. In the end, endurance was not a single great act, but thousands of small ones. It was another stick on the fire, another stitch in a mitten, another story told to restless children. It was faith that spring would come, even when the world outside seemed made of nothing but cold and silence. Even in the cruelest winters, whispers of spring found ways to reach waiting hearts. The frontier winters often felt endless, a gray wall of wind and snow that pressed down upon families with weary weight. And yet, even the hardest season could not hold forever. Subtle signs, gentle at first, would creep into the days. Settlers learned to notice them, to treasure them, for they were not just changes in weather, but promises. quiet assurances that life was stirring again beneath the snow. The first sign might be the quality of light. After months of short, dim days, a woman sewing by lamplight might suddenly look up and realize the sun lingered just a little longer. The sky, though still iron cold, softened with hints of rose and gold. The days are stretching, a Nebraska settler once wrote in her diary, and so too stretches my hope. That small shift in daylight was like a hand laid gently on the shoulder, reminding them that seasons turned, even here. Another sign was sound. For weeks the world had been muffled, every noise swallowed by snow and wind. Then, on a still morning, the faint drip of melting icicles might be heard. That sound, water where before there had only been ice, was enough to make children race outside, bareheaded, laughing at the drops. The drip, drip, drip was our music of spring. One elderly woman remembered of her childhood. It was a melody more hopeful than any hymn. The animals, too, carried messages. Chickens that had grown thin and sluggish in the dark winter began laying eggs again. Cows, huddled and lean, moved with more energy as the air eased. Horses tossed their heads and stamped, no longer shivering but eager. Even the smallest signs, tracks of a rabbit near the barn, the call of a returning bird, were celebrated like miracles. Food stores, though still low, began to feel less terrifying once spring seemed possible. Families who had rationed every crumb dared to add a little more to the evening pot. A child might be surprised with a larger slice of bread, or a mother might cook the last preserved fruit, whispering, "We've made it this far." The promise of planting season gave courage. Soon gardens would sprout, cellars would fill again, and the hunger would ease. Some settlers wrote of the snow itself changing. In deepest winter, it had been hard, dry, like tiny needles in the wind. But as spring approached, it grew softer. Snowballs stuck together. Drifts sagged and melted at the edges. A child could shape a snowman without frostbite threatening his fingers. The snow began to surrender, one farmer recalled, and with it, my fear. There were less obvious signs too. Changes in the human spirit. Neighbors, long sealed indoors, began to visit again. Paths were cleared. Doors opened. Voices carried across the hollows. Families who had shared hardship through the winter gathered to speak of planting, of hopes for crops, of barn repairs and weddings postponed until fair weather. The conversations shifted from surviving to living. Of course, spring did not arrive gently everywhere. Often the first thaw brought mud, floods, and illness from spoiled food. Yet even those troubles were endured with a lighter heart. To slog through mud was far better than to stagger through drifts. To face a swollen creek was to face moving water, not frozen silence. The very messiness of spring was welcome. It meant life had returned to the land. One settler woman wrote that her favorite spring ritual was sweeping the floorboards free of the fine dust and ash that had accumulated all winter. She would throw open the door, let the breeze push in, and sweep until her arms ached. It was as though I was sweeping winter itself out the door, she explained. The air still carried chill, but it was fresher, lighter, filled with possibility. Children, restless after months indoors, exploded into the outdoors at the first opportunity. They ran through slush, chased each other around puddles, pressed their hands into the softening earth. Mothers might scold them for wet shoes, but their laughter was too precious to silence. That laughter was itself a sign of spring, the sound of young lungs filling with air that no longer threatened to freeze. The return of birds was among the most cherished signs. Settlers wrote of listening for the first meadowlark's call, a sound so piercingly sweet it could bring tears to the eyes of those who had endured silence for so long. One elderly man recalled that his father would remove his hat whenever he heard it, as if greeting an honored guest. The bird's song meant not only survival, but renewal. Spring also meant work, backbreaking though it was. Gardens had to be dug, seed planted, fences mended. Yet settlers welcomed the toil, for it meant they were free of winter's prison. The ache of muscles was preferable to the ache of cold. Sweat was a blessing compared to shivers. In their minds, spring's labors were not burdens, but rewards, proof that they had endured the long trial. For some, the thaw carried grief alongside hope. Families who had lost loved ones in the winter were reminded of empty chairs when doors opened again. Melted snow revealed graves once hidden, wooden markers leaning in the thawing earth. Yet even in mourning, spring gave solace, the assurance that the living could continue, that the land itself was forgiving, that new seasons would follow. In every settlement, spring became a time of stories. Around the hearth, families would recall the hardest nights, the storms survived, the desperate choices made. They would retell them with a mixture of sorrow and pride, shaping lessons for the next generation. Remember, they would say, how we thought the cold would never end. And yet, here we are. These stories, carried year to year, were as vital as any seed planted in the soil, and so endurance gave way to gratitude. Every bird, every bud, every stream running free was a reminder that the prairie could be cruel, but not unendingly so. Life had a way of returning, of pushing green shoots through hardened ground, of bringing color back to gray. Settlers learned to trust these signs, to take comfort in them, to build their hope upon them. In the hush that follows winter, we hear the quiet wisdom of those who endured. When all was said and done, when the storms had passed and the snow had melted into rivulets that carved their way across the prairie, there was always a moment of pause. It was a silence not of fear, but of release. Families stepped out from their cabins, their sod houses, or their dugouts, and felt the weight of winter lift, though slowly, like a shawl being slipped from weary shoulders. What remained in its place was reflection, soft, tender, shaped by hardship and survival. The closing of a frontier winter was not celebrated with parades or grand speeches. It was marked instead by small gestures, intimate and humble. A mother would place the last of the firewood back into the stack rather than into the stove, saving it for another time. A father would lay aside his patched mittens, grateful that they had carried him through another season. Children would play in puddles, their boots muddy but their spirits bright. These simple acts were the punctuation marks at the end of winter's long sentence. Settlers carried forward more than scars or stories. They carried wisdom etched into their daily habits. They knew the value of preparation, of gathering fuel until the pile seemed excessive, of preserving food until the cellar brimmed. They learned the necessity of leaning on neighbors, of checking chimneys for smoke, of sharing what little they had. And they discovered the resilience of the human spirit, how laughter could coexist with hunger, how kindness could survive in the coldest season. There was an old saying among those who endured: a lone settler was a dead settler. It was not cynicism, but truth. Winter revealed that survival was not found in rugged independence, but in connection. Each family, each household, was a thread in a larger weave. When woven tightly together, the cloth held strong against storms. When frayed and apart, it unraveled with frightening speed. Those who lived through many winters did not forget this lesson, even when times grew easier. For the elderly who looked back on their frontier childhoods, winter memories were always spoken of with a mixture of awe and solemnity. They would tell of waking to frozen quilts, of ice on the inside walls, of fathers who returned home with hands blackened by frostbite. Yet their voices softened when recalling the warmth of a mother's stories by lamplight, the comfort of siblings huddled close, the kindness of neighbors who arrived just in time. Memory was not only of hardship, but of the love that bloomed in its midst. Communities, shaped by these winters, developed a rhythm of care that endured beyond the frontier years. Churches and schools became gathering places not only for worship or learning, but for reassurance. Farmers watched each other's fields, families shared food in lean years, and when storms threatened, they prepared together. Out of survival grew culture, and out of culture grew traditions that lingered long after sod houses gave way to painted, clapboard homes. Endurance, once born of necessity, became heritage. It wove itself into the way families spoke of thrift, of gratitude, of remembering to put something aside for harder days. It became the reason why grandparents told grandchildren not to waste bread, why neighbors looked in on each other when the weather turned foul, why rural towns across the Midwest still pride themselves on generosity in crisis. These were not just habits. They were the echoes of frontier winters, and in all of it was a quiet reverence for the land itself. Harsh though it was, the prairie had been both enemy and teacher. It tested families until they bent, but it also offered lessons about patience, humility, and respect. Settlers came to see that survival did not mean conquering the land, but learning to live with it, to read its signs, to trust its rhythms. That understanding, hard-won, became a legacy carried forward in ways both spoken and silent. Now, as we look back from our heated homes and bright electric lamps, it can be difficult to imagine the true depth of those winters. Yet the wisdom of endurance still whispers to us. It reminds us that life is fragile, but also resilient, that human beings can endure more than they believe, and that comfort is sweeter when earned through trial. It tells us that survival is not only about firewood or food, but about faith, kindness, and connection. Picture it: a family gathered at the close of winter. The father leans against the doorway, watching the snow recede into patches of brown earth. The mother kneels in the garden plot, her fingers brushing damp soil, ready to plant again. Children laugh as they chase each other through the mud, their boots splashing, their voices carrying far. A neighbor waves from across the field, and the wave is returned. No words are needed. They all know what they have come through. They all know what it means to stand here, alive, together. And in that moment, a kind of peace settles. It is not the peace of ease or plenty, but of understanding, of knowing that hardship has been faced, lessons have been learned, and life, fragile as it is, continues. The prairie is no gentler, the winters no less severe, but the people are stronger. And their stories, passed down quietly from one generation to the next, remind us even now of what it means to endure. The cold once haunted every night, but today warmth waits at a simple touch. The world we live in today feels almost unrecognizable when set beside the frontier winters of a century and more ago. Where once families rose before dawn to coax reluctant coals into life, we now turn a small dial or press a switch and watch heat spread evenly through every room. What once demanded weeks of gathering fuel, stacking buffalo chips, or hauling wood has become an act so simple that it borders on thoughtless. Yet remembering the past gives even the hum of a furnace its quiet dignity. Modern houses are sealed tightly against the wind, their walls thick with insulation. Windows, once thin panes that rattled in storms, now hold double or triple glass, keeping warmth inside and cold at bay. A storm may rage beyond the walls, but we sit at ease, listening not with dread but with calm curiosity. Where once children shivered under layers of patched quilts, they now drift to sleep in comfort, unaware of how hard-won such ease truly is. The contrast is startling. In diaries of the old prairie, winter was spoken of with tones of fear, measuring food against days, praying the fire would not go out, whispering to children to be still and conserve heat. Today, winter is more often a season of decoration and festivity, of lights strung across eaves and cups of cocoa by fireplaces that are chosen for beauty as much as function. We celebrate the snow without fearing it, watch it fall from windows that do not leak, step outside bundled in coats designed not only to protect, but to flatter. Yet comfort has a way of erasing memory. It tempts us to believe that survival was always so easy, that the world bends naturally towards safety. The truth is gentler but deeper. Every warm night we enjoy stands upon the shoulders of those who once braved the long cold with only sod walls and burning grass. Their lessons about preparation, about resilience, about community, lie hidden beneath our comfort like strong roots beneath soft grass. Consider food. The frontier family spent autumn in a rush of canning, drying, salting, storing, each task urgent, each mistake a threat to survival. Today we wander through aisles of supermarkets where oranges from Florida sit beside apples from Washington and bananas shipped across oceans. Winter hunger, once a constant dread, has been replaced by an abundance so complete it dulls our sense of wonder. And yet, to pause before a well-stocked pantry is to echo the old relief. There is enough to last until spring. Clothing, too, tells the story of change. Once, fur-lined moccasins and woolen mittens were treasures, patched and repatched, passed down through families. Today, synthetic fibers and modern designs keep us warm even in storms that would have terrified our ancestors. A jacket purchased casually can repel winds that once cut through leather and wool alike. The lessons of layering, of protecting hands with mittens instead of gloves, live on in outdoor guides. But few of us must test them as a matter of survival. The change is more than material. It is emotional. Winter no longer stands as an adversary to be endured at all costs. Instead, it has become a backdrop for gatherings, holidays, and quiet reflection. Where once snow meant danger, today it often means beauty. We marvel at the sparkle of frost on branches, not fearing that it might reach into our very homes. We light candles not because darkness threatens, but because we desire their glow. And yet, something within us still remembers. When storms knock out power for a night, when roads close and the cupboards thin, we feel a trace of that old frontier anxiety. It is as if the memory of hardship lingers in our bones, reminding us of how fragile comfort can be. These rare interruptions become moments of perspective, teaching us again to value warmth, to treasure food, to lean on neighbors. This is perhaps the greatest inheritance, not the specific techniques of survival, but the spirit that underlies them. The settlers adapted, endured, and leaned on one another. In our modern world, though the challenges differ, the same truth holds. Comfort is more secure when shared, resilience stronger when built together. So as we sit in homes where warmth is no longer uncertain, let us not forget the quiet courage of those who came before. Their struggle shapes our ease, their patience, our abundance. To remember them is to honor every flicker of fire, every careful ration, every neighborly knock upon a frozen door. What once meant rationing and hunger is now abundance within reach. Step gently now into another reflection. If warmth has changed beyond recognition since the days of sod houses, so too has food, the very foundation of survival. On the frontier, the pantry was not an afterthought. It was the heart of the household, a vault of hope. Each barrel of potatoes, each string of onions, each crock of sauerkraut was weighed not just in pounds, but in days of life. When stores dwindled, anxiety grew. Children watched their parents' faces more closely than they watched their bowls, sensing the silent arithmetic of survival being performed at the table. Today, we wander through wide, brightly lit aisles lined with more food than our great-grandparents might have seen in a year. A trip to the grocery store is measured in minutes, not in months of labor. Shelves bend under the weight of options. Fresh fruit in the middle of January, bread still warm from the oven, packaged goods designed to last far longer than any storm. Where frontier families once measured potatoes one by one, we now push carts filled with more than enough, often without a second thought. The contrast feels almost like magic. Imagine explaining to a pioneer mother that her descendants could taste oranges in December or strawberries in February. She might shake her head, laugh at the impossibility, or even wonder if such plenty would make people careless. And in some ways, she would be right. Abundance carries its own subtle dangers. The temptation to waste, the ease of forgetting what hunger once meant. Preservation, which was once a skill every family practiced, has become a choice, often a hobby. Where frontier kitchens steamed with the labor of canning, salting, drying, and smoking, our kitchens today hum with the quiet buzz of refrigerators and freezers. These machines, so commonplace we barely notice them, have quietly replaced the ingenuity of centuries. To the frontier child, the cellar with its barrels and crocks was a treasure cave. To the modern child, the refrigerator is simply where the milk waits, cool and ready. And yet, echoes remain. Farmers' markets revive the old rhythm of harvest and storage. Home cooks who pickle or dry fruit tap into ancient patterns of reassurance. Some still fill shelves with jars of tomatoes or beans, lined in rows of amber and green. But these are acts of heritage, not survival. If a jar spoils or a batch fails, there is no danger, only disappointment. That small difference, danger replaced by inconvenience, marks the enormous gulf between past and present. Food once measured character as much as sustenance. Families who rationed carefully, who resisted the temptation to feast early in the season, often survived. Those who miscalculated sometimes did not. In diaries of the era, hunger was described not just as an ache in the stomach, but as a shadow over the spirit. The body grew weaker, but so did the mind. Today, hunger still exists in our world, but in different forms and different places. In most American homes, it is not winter itself that threatens, but poverty, inequality, or distance from opportunity. The snow may pile high, but the store remains open. Trucks still arrive, shelves still fill. What is easy to overlook is that the knowledge of scarcity once united people. A neighbor who had a little more flour or dried meat would quietly share. A community that gathered for a communal meal was not celebrating, it was surviving. Today, we share food for joy rather than survival. We gather at long tables for holidays, set out more than anyone can eat, and let abundance itself become the language of affection. But in quieter ways, the old lessons still matter. Food banks, community kitchens, and neighborhood gardens all echo the communal spirit of the frontier. When storms disrupt supply chains, when shelves thin for even a few days, the memory flickers back. Food is not simply a convenience, it is life itself, and in those moments, the old stories regain their weight. Perhaps that is why the taste of a simple potato soup or a piece of salted bread can feel strangely comforting. These foods, humble and plain, are tied by memory to survival itself. They remind us that nourishment need not always be extravagant to matter. A bowl of soup shared on a cold night carries the same warmth across centuries. So while we live in a time when hunger rarely shadows the winter months, we can still pause to honor what food once meant. Each apple in the fridge, each loaf of bread on the counter, each jar of jam on the shelf is part of a long chain stretching back to those dim root cellars. Their abundance would have been a miracle to the frontier family, and even now it deserves to be treated with gratitude. What once risked frostbite is now a choice of comfort and style. There is a quiet poetry in how clothing has changed over the centuries. In the days of frontier winters, a single garment could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Mittens sewn from rabbit fur, woolen leggings patched again and again, leather boots rubbed with tallow until they were soft enough to bend. These were not luxuries, but lifelines. A mistake in clothing was often punished swiftly, with frostbitten fingers or toes serving as grim reminders. Today, our closets are filled with choices. Coats for fashion, coats for rain, coats for the faint chill of autumn, and coats built for storms most of us will never face. Synthetic fibers and down linings provide warmth beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. A jacket purchased casually at a department store could withstand winds that once tore through sod houses and cracked leather. We have, in many ways, insulated ourselves from the need to think carefully about what we wear in winter. Shelter, too, has transformed. Where settlers once relied on sod walls, often damp and alive with insects, we now live within homes that are not only safe but comfortable. Thick insulation hides in our walls. Central heating hums in the background, so steady it fades from awareness. Roofs are engineered to carry heavy snows, windows designed to resist the cold. The very concept of a home has shifted from a fortress against nature to a stage for daily life, decorated and rearranged with ease. But when we pause, we see that the echoes of necessity still remain. The idea of layering clothing, so carefully passed from one settler to another, is now a fashion and practical staple. Outdoor enthusiasts still speak of the wisdom of wool, the value of mittens over gloves, the need to keep the body's core warm. In hiking shops and ski lodges, advice echoes nearly word for word what was once spoken on the prairies. Avoid cotton, choose wool, protect the feet, and never underestimate the wind. The difference is that for us, these words prepare us for recreation, not survival. It is remarkable to think how shelter once demanded daily vigilance. Families banked soil against walls, checked for drafts, and reinforced roofs with every passing season. Today, many of us have never seen the bones of our own homes, never thought about the thickness of the insulation, never wondered whether the walls will hold against the storm. These are worries delegated to codes, to builders, to inspectors. And yet, when a power outage darkens a neighborhood or a blizzard presses hard against the siding, a flicker of old memory returns. We are reminded, briefly, that shelter is still the first defense. and that its quiet reliability should not be taken for granted. The evolution of clothing and shelter tells a larger story about human progress. We have moved from garments that barely held the cold at bay to fabrics that wick moisture, trap heat, and resist wind. We have shifted from sod houses that leaked when the snow melted to homes so well sealed that we sometimes need to add ventilation for fresh air. The struggle for survival has become the pursuit of comfort. Yet, woven into these modern conveniences, the wisdom of those who came before still lives. When we fasten a scarf carefully, when we pull mittens over our hands, when we notice the warmth of a home on a bitter night, we are in quiet conversation with history. We may not need these precautions to stay alive, but they remind us that generations before us did. Their clothing bore the marks of survival. Their homes carried the weight of storms. Our comfort is their legacy. So perhaps the greatest gift is not the abundance of choices or the ease of warmth, but the reminder that these comforts are hard-won. Each winter jacket, each sturdy roof beam, each softly humming furnace carries a story that stretches back to those who fought the cold with far less. And in remembering them, we deepen our gratitude for the homes and garments that cradle us today. Where survival once meant neighbors at the door, now it often means a message on a screen. On the winter frontier, community was not optional. It was the difference between enduring and vanishing. Neighbors kept watch on each other's chimneys, ensuring smoke still rose. They shared fuel when supplies ran low, dismantling even their own homes to feed another family's fire. They gathered together for Sunday meals, not as recreation, but as a strategy of survival. A lone settler, no matter how strong, was a vulnerable settler. Today, community looks different. The streets of our towns are well lit, the grocery store remains open even in heavy snow, and furnaces run quietly no matter how fierce the storm outside. The bond of survival has loosened. We can live in a neighborhood for years and never truly need the people who live around us. Our connections are often digital, voices carried by phones or faces flickering on screens. In many ways, it is remarkable. In other ways, it leaves us wondering whether something essential has been lost. When storms sweep across the country now, we hear warnings through television, phones, and alerts. Neighbors may check in with each other, but more often they check weather apps. The old rhythm of walking through the snow to ensure a family was safe has been replaced by text messages. It is efficient, it is instant, but perhaps it does not carry the same warmth. And yet, when disaster truly strikes, the old spirit often returns. When power grids fail, neighbors string extension cords across yards. When floods rise, strangers carry sandbags together. When blizzards trap cars on highways, communities set up shelters in schools and churches. The instinct remains. Beneath the surface of independence, there is still the truth that we are stronger together than apart. Modern community does not revolve around physical survival in the same way, but it still shapes the texture of our days. We gather in different ways, at community centers, in libraries, through volunteer work, in places of worship. The threat is no longer frostbite or starvation, but loneliness, isolation, and disconnection. And the answer, just as it was in the 1800s, remains the same: the presence of others. Think of the frontier woman who could not rise from her bed after losing a child. Her neighbors came to cook, tend fires, feed the other children. Today, when grief or hardship arrives, neighbors may bring food, send flowers, or simply sit in quiet company. The forms differ, but the heart is unchanged. Humans need each other, especially when life grows difficult. The lesson of frontier community lingers in subtle traditions. Potlucks, where everyone brings a dish to share, echo the survival meals of the prairie. Holiday gatherings, where families open their doors to friends and neighbors, carry the same message. Abundance shared is abundance multiplied. Even in our abundance, we recreate patterns that once kept hunger and despair at bay. Perhaps the greatest change is that we now have the choice. We can isolate ourselves with comfort, never needing to borrow, never needing to lend. But those who choose connection discover what settlers once knew, that joy deepens when shared, and burdens grow lighter when carried together. Where rest once meant mere survival, now it can mean true peace of mind. In the cabins of the frontier, rest was not a luxury. It was fragile, often broken by the howl of wind or the creak of timbers under snow. Families huddled together on rope beds, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned, sharing warmth with each other, sometimes even with animals. Sleep came in short intervals, light and uneasy, because fire needed tending, babies needed comforting, and danger never slept. Compare that to our nights today. We lie beneath soft blankets, warmed by steady heat flowing through vents we scarcely notice. Our beds are wide, our pillows many, and sleep is something we can hope for, not simply as relief from exhaustion, but as a gift of comfort. The silence that surrounds us is different too, broken not by storms rattling the walls, but by the hum of a refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic. Where they strained to drift into rest, we sometimes struggle to quiet our minds in the very abundance they dreamed of. The change is remarkable. Rest has shifted from being about sheer survival of the body to nurturing the spirit. The frontier family measured nights by whether they woke alive. We measure nights by how refreshed we feel in the morning. This is progress, yes, but it also leaves us with a quiet responsibility to honor rest not as an afterthought, but as an essential part of being human. Today, entire industries encourage us to sleep more soundly. Mattresses crafted with scientific care, machines that create white noise, apps that promise to guide our breathing. What once required no guidance at all has become a skill to be relearned in modern life. Perhaps it is not so different, after all. Where pioneers fought the elements to keep their fires glowing, we now fight the distractions of light, noise, and endless information. The enemy has changed shape, but the need for rest remains constant. Reflection, too, has transformed. For frontier families, long winter nights pressed reflection upon them. With little light and little activity, the mind turned inward. Diaries filled with worries over dwindling food, with prayers for neighbors' safety, with gratitude for small mercies. Their reflections were forged by hardship. Ours, if we pause to allow them, are shaped by choice. We can scroll past them, or we can linger. And so, when we choose to reflect, we step into an unbroken chain that connects us to those cabins. We pause to think not of survival, but of meaning. We ask ourselves not, will we make it to spring? But, how do we wish to spend these days we are given? Reflection now has room to stretch, to deepen, to wander into gratitude, creativity, and peace. It may be that the greatest progress of all is not the warmth of our homes or the abundance of our food, but the possibility of true rest, to lay down without fear that the fire will die or the roof will give way, to fall asleep without counting fuel or measuring rations, to rest with the trust that tomorrow will arrive safely. That is a gift won by countless sacrifices before us. Rest today is no longer about surviving the cold night, but about savoring peace. As we close our eyes in safe rooms, The memory of those who endured before us lingers, reminding us to treat each night's sleep as a blessing, gentle and complete.